50 years ago, Dallas, Texas was a cauldron of hate. Radical right-wing groups were accusing President John F. Kennedy of being a traitor and too soft on communism. White supremacists thought he was too indulgent of America's increasingly impatient black community. And of course, others just didn't like him because he was a liberal Catholic from Massachusetts. Two new authors suggest it was no coincidence that JFK was assassinated in Texas's biggest city, and they join us now on the line from Austin, Texas. And here are Bill Minutaglio, that's him on the right, and Stephen L. Davis on the left. They are the authors of Dallas 1963. Gentlemen, it's good to have you on TVO tonight. I want to start by just reading a short excerpt from your book to set the scene for the discussion to come. Dallas and America are in danger. The East Coast liberals, the big city Catholics, the government-loving socialists are sapping the faith and eroding the bedrock of the republic, weakening the country in the face of a very clear communist onslaught. It isn't paranoia, it is real. And too many people are turning a blind eye to the threat. Put us back, Bill, start with you. Put us back in Dallas of 1963 and tell us how prevalent that view was back then.
There was no city like Dallas in America. It had become the epicenter of anti-Kennedy resistance and really the epicenter of an hysteria, the sense that there was encroaching socialism and surely behind it communism. There was a dash of Catholic phobia. We talk about Islamophobia today. Back then it was Catholic phobia. There was really a sense in Dallas that if people, a handful of people there didn't do something, that the U.S. would be annihilated, that Kennedy was weak-willed, he was untrustworthy. Fate, circumstance, poetry, and a lot of money and a spiritual kind of crusade began coalescing in Dallas to make it the headquarters again of the anti-Kennedy resistance, really from the minute that he was elected in 1960, and of course right until he passed away in Dallas in November of '63.
Stephen, the events of 50 years ago tomorrow took place on Dealey Plaza, right beside Dealey Plaza, and I think people will be surprised to hear who Dealey Plaza is named after. Who was Ted Dealey?
Ted Dealey he was the publisher of the Dallas Morning News at that time. The plaza was named for his father. Very important family in Dallas. And the Dallas Morning News was the most powerful newspaper and the most influential newspaper in the South, and was really leading the resistance to John Kennedy, basically bashing Kennedy as a socialist when it came to civil rights and integration, accusing Kennedy of coddling the Russians. And Ted Dealey himself actually traveled to the White House in order to confront John Kennedy personally, and told the president to his face, America needs a man on horseback to lead this country. And too many of us in Texas and the Southwest think you're riding Caroline's tricycle.
He said that to the president.
Ted Dealey was just one. He said that to the president at a social luncheon in the White House, attended with several other publishers from Texas.
And what did the other publishers say when he said that?
Many of them began kind of shouting, no, he doesn't speak for us. One of them told him, Ted, you're leading the worst fascist movement in the Southwest. And they were humiliated because the difference between Ted Dealey and these other publishers, who were also conservative, they saw Kennedy as a political opponent, but Ted Dealey saw JFK as an enemy of the state, an enemy of America, and that was the line that he and these other people in Dallas crossed.
And yet, Bill, in 1960, the state of Texas did go for the Kennedy-Johnson ticket, and yet Dallas, the city, went overwhelmingly for Richard Nixon. And yet Nixon blamed Dallas for his loss. How come?
That's exactly right. It was the most contested presidential election up to that time period in American history. Kennedy and Nixon, as we know, were staggering toward the finish line, very, very close together. Bobby Kennedy, President Kennedy's brother, who was helping to manage his campaign, essentially ordered vice presidential candidate, senator from Texas, LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, to retreat to Texas to try to salvage the state and frankly, hopefully, push the ticket over the edge to a victory. It was that close, and ironic that LBJ, the great senator from Texas, would have to go to retreat to his home state to try to nail it down. 4 days before the November 1960 election, he came to Dallas and was greeted by a mob. It's been called by historians the mink coat mob. And what happened to him is he stepped out of a limousine in downtown Dallas to go give a speech in the fanciest hotel in the state of Texas. 300 very well-dressed citizens of the city, folks who lived a little bit above the cloud line. They had a great sphere of influence. They had coalesced, organized to really just attack LBJ and his wife, the very demure and dignified Lady Bird Johnson, right on the streets of Dallas and then in a hotel lobby. And I mean attack. They were swinging placards at them, sticks. They were spitting at them, pulling out hat pins and trying to stab them. Some bones were broken, some blood was shed. The police had to intervene. And also what had happened, really unbeknownst to these folks who loathed Kennedy and Johnson so much, was the fact that the cameras were rolling. And these images later that evening and in subsequent days were broadcast around the nation. And a lot of political analysts say that in an amazing irony, when you consider what happened with Kennedy in '63 in Dallas, that event in November of 1960 might have catapulted Kennedy to the White House, because some folks voted in sympathy for Kennedy and LBJ. They saw the civic hysteria. I call it an adult Lord of the Flies moment, where all the rules of civil behavior were just simply smashed. And people went crazy in their hatred and their vitriol. And so perhaps some folks saw those images later that evening and again subsequent days and said, you know what, I'm voting for Kennedy and Johnson. And we maintain, and perhaps it's provocative, but I think we argue that the Kennedy administration arguably began in Dallas because of that moment. And then, of course, there was this outburst of violence in November of '63 that ended his presidency.
I want to take you to the month before, Stephen, which is October of '63. And I think we've all heard of the department store Neiman Marcus. Stanley Marcus is the Marcus, and he was operating his store in Dallas at the time. And he invites the United Nations ambassador, Adlai Stevenson, former Democratic presidential candidate, to come and speak in Dallas to basically show the country that Dallas isn't a place filled with, right-wing extremists. How did that visit go?
Not very well. One of the charges hurled against Kennedy from Dallas is that he would surrender the sovereignty of the United States to the United Nations. And it was one of the great fears that was being whipped up in the city. So Stanley Marcus had this brilliant idea to invite the UN ambassador, Adlai Stevenson, to come to Dallas to sort of placate the population, to reason with them, to explain very rationally that the United Nations was no threat to the United States. And he was met by an angry mob, similar to what happened to LBJ and Lady Bird. And this, again, as you mentioned, was 1 month before John Kennedy's visit. Stevenson was attacked. He was spat upon. People were throwing punches at him. He was hit on the head with a picket sign. And he was kind of hustled into a getaway car by Stanley Marcus. Really almost lost his life on the streets of downtown Dallas. The car was rocked and tipped and finally burst away. And that's when Stevenson turned to Stanley Marcus and said, "My God, are these human beings or are these animals?"
Bill, there's the quote from your book, which I will read right now. Millions of Americans are opening their morning newspapers to find shocking photos from Dallas. Breathless reports describe a city that seems to have gone insane. Anti-United Nations demonstrators shoved, booed, berated, and spat in the face of Adlai E. Stevenson. Privately, Stevenson is very concerned about Kennedy's safety in the city. There was something very ugly and frightening about the atmosphere, he said. I'm wondering why it was that police, Bill, seemed so completely unable to protect public figures who were in Dallas at the time. Is there a story there?
Yeah, I don't think it was a conspiracy. I don't think folks at the police station were saying, well, let's just let this play out because we happen to agree with these people who are vociferous. That said, there was a climate of almost tolerance in Dallas for this kind of behavior, and that's because the folks that we're talking about, the folks who are at the epicenter of this anti-Kennedy fanaticism, really, were the most powerful figures in the city. We really want to underscore something, by the way, that the vast majority of people in Dallas either loved Kennedy, or if they didn't love him, at least respected the office enough not to behave in violent ways. But what you had was almost a perfect storm. You had the world's richest man, H.L. Hunt, living in Dallas, pouring millions of dollars into extremist radio, printing broadsides that were completely dedicated to, frankly, overthrowing Kennedy. You had the most powerful Baptist preacher in America, casting a great sphere of influence in the city, happened to be based in Dallas, Reverend W.A. Criswell, a very, very powerful and influential spiritual figure in Dallas and Texas, around the South. And he thoroughly disliked and distrusted Kennedy. He thought Kennedy, again, was practicing this dark art of Catholicism, and that in a Kennedy administration, the U.S. would be under the sway of the papacy. And you had the media magnate, Ted Dealey, who was using the editorial pages to beat up on Kennedy, and by the way, also launching an investigation into Kennedy's personal life. He believed that Ted Kennedy had privately, secretly been married to someone else prior to his marriage to Jacqueline. So you had this public resistance, this personal animus, and again, it was in the handful of a handful of folks, extremely strident, extremely convinced that Kennedy was leading the country to perdition, to a moral wasteland, and frankly, nuclear annihilation at the hands of the Russian bear. And I can't help but think that, you know, when you have folks live above the cloud line, you really set sort of the agenda of the city, politically, socially, and even religiously. That probably has some little bit of influence as it trickles down to law enforcement, and that might have created a more lax atmosphere in some way.
And Stephen, we haven't even mentioned yet the defrocked General Edwin Walker, who actually was Lee Harvey Oswald's first target. Oswald tried to kill him before he tried to kill Kennedy. What was his contribution to this melee?
Well, you know, we had these city leaders in Dallas, as we've discussed, you know, the publisher of the newspaper, the wealthiest man in the world, the spiritual leader, the congressman who led the mink coat mob. And they attracted an even more extreme person, and that was General Edwin Walker, who had been relieved of his command by John Kennedy because he had been brainwashing his troops with far-right John Birch Society literature. Walker angrily resigned from the military, became a martyr and a hero to the far right, and moved to Dallas, Texas to launch the new phase of his life, which basically was dedicated to taking John Kennedy down. You know, you could really say that in America during this time, we had a cold civil war going on over the issue of integration. We had never really settled that since the Civil War. General Walker wanted to turn that civil war hot, and he did it a number of ways. You know, he was the one who basically led this riot against Adlai Stevenson that we discussed earlier. He also led a pretty violent anti-integration riot at the University of Mississippi, which caused people to die. There were dozens of U.S. Marshals wounded by gunfire. And John Kennedy in the Oval Office, you can hear him on the recording saying, well, he calls Walker names that you really can't say on television. He asked his Solicitor General to arrest General Walker. And the general was thrown in a federal psychiatric prison, charged with insurrection and sedition against the United States of America. And it was Walker, once he was released, returned to Dallas to a hero's welcome. You know, this is a guy who, when he even first came to the city, was welcomed by the mayor, given a Stetson hat, a proclamation, and cheered by thousands of people. And, you know, in Dallas, his actions against John Kennedy became more and more extreme as the Kennedy administration rolled on. And it was Walker and his people who produced this really horribly ugly flyer that appeared on the streets of Dallas, November 22nd, 1963. It's the flyer that you can see reflected in the cover of our book. It basically had John Kennedy depicted as a series of mugshots with the headline, "Wanted for Treason," and, you know, accusing Kennedy of selling out the country to the communists and various other things. But again, you have this whole idea being led by these leading citizens of Dallas to define our president not just as a political opponent, but really as an enemy. And of course, the penalty for treason is death.
Stephen, what was Kennedy's reaction when he was in Dallas that morning and he saw that in the paper?
Yes, there was also a full-page ad in Ted Dealey's newspaper, the Dallas Morning News, that sort of mockingly said, "Welcome, Mr. Kennedy, to Dallas," and basically laid out the same charges that you saw in this wanted for treason flyer. When John Kennedy saw that in the Dallas Morning News, the same paper where the publisher had come to the White House to berate him, he turned to Jackie and said, "Well, we're heading into nut country today."
Bill, so all of this is in the air. We have Kennedy, of course, deciding to come to Dallas because he's campaigning for re-election in some respects, and he's trying to get those Texas numbers up. All sorts of people. Stanley Marcus from Neiman Marcus, Byron Skelton from the Texas Democratic Party, the Arkansas Senator, J. William Fulbright. They all say, cancel the trip, don't come to Dallas.
Right.
What's the Kennedy administration's reaction to those admonitions?
You know, I filter that question through my understanding of Kennedy's personality. He's famous for writing something called Profiles in Courage, and I think he wasn't afraid. He wasn't afraid of what he knew was out there. And in September of 1960, to go back a little bit, he decided to confront some of this demonizing that was going on in Dallas. It was emanating there. He came to Dallas to confront the notion that he was controlled by the Pope. He came in September of 1960 to talk to folks in Dallas about, look at me, I'm here, I'm right in front of you, I'm not controlled by any person practicing the dark art again of Catholicism. I'm under the sway of no man, and I'll be your leader. And I think, you know, he certainly heard these admonitions and warnings coming from Adlai Stevenson, filtered up through Stanley Marcus, who was relaying messages to LBJ and then by extension to Kennedy, and numerous folks who basically were saying the same thing. The temperature is really being turned up in Dallas. It's getting hotter, and there's something really unusual in this city. And there had been the sense of a cascading set of events. Earlier in '63, Dr. Martin Luther King had come to Dallas in January of '63 to give his first large-scale public appearance in that city. Some folks say he himself had been avoiding Dallas and had been warned not to go there. When he came to Dallas in '63, there was a bomb threat lodged against him. Lee Harvey Oswald had already tried to attempt to assassinate General Walker in April of '63. There was violence in the air. There were other things happening in the spring and summer of '63, still building up to Kennedy's arrival. Stanley Marcus, the owner of the famous iconic store, came downtown and found swastikas slathered across his store. So things were clearly going wrong in Dallas, but I think Kennedy just said, I want to go there. You know, going back to the luncheon that Steve was talking about earlier, where Ted Dealey accosted the president, just yelling at him, calling him a little child. You're just like Caroline on a tricycle. Kennedy, very jocularly, I thought, yelled out, "Cancel my subscription to the Dallas Morning News." I think it was his way of having this chinny brio, this sense of, I won't be cowed, and I won't be afraid by your demonizing, by your polarizing, by your inability to have a dialogue. And he was coming to Dallas to just have a dialogue. And he had a beautifully written and ultimately undelivered speech to give.
Stephen, in one of those absolutely crazy coincidences of history, on November 22nd, 1963, there were actually three men who would be president, who were all in Dallas on that day. Obviously, the current president, John Kennedy, his vice president, who would take over, Lyndon Johnson, after the assassination, and Richard Nixon was in Dallas on that day as well. What was Nixon doing there?
Well, you know, that's one of the little-known facts of history. And actually, Nixon had, you know, gone into basically private practice as a lawyer, as a corporate lawyer, was just kind of raking in money. It was easier to do that than through politics, apparently. And he had come to Dallas. He was brought in by Pepsi Cola to speak at their convention and basically to meet with folks. He was just kind of paid to be a figurehead there. And when he was in Dallas, it was really interesting because Dick Nixon had famously forsworn politics a couple of years earlier. You know, after he lost to Kennedy, he ran for governor of California and was defeated, and basically gave a famous news conference where he said, you know, you won't have Dick Nixon to kick around anymore, and resigned from public life. But when he was in Dallas, he was coming back to a place that was very, very friendly to him, and he really became very relaxed and unwound, and entertained reporters from the Dallas Morning News in his hotel room and gave long interviews and just seemed very happy. And then the morning of November 22nd, you know, he went to Love Field, the same airport where John Kennedy and LBJ were due to arrive a couple of hours later. You know, there were no crowds cheering Nixon then. He just walked up onto the plane and flew away. And he basically, I think he had just landed back in New York when the news broke out of the assassination.
I don't know which one of you found this other nugget of information, but I learned in your book that after the Dallas visit, which obviously was intended to end successfully. The presidential party was supposed to go to Austin, Texas, where you guys are right now. And the last line in Lyndon Johnson's speech was supposed to be, "Mr. President, thank God you got out of Dallas alive." Who found that out?
This is actually something that Stanley Marcus has reported in his memoir. You know, Stanley Marcus was very close to Lyndon Johnson. They both were sort of closet Democrats in the state of Texas, which was a pretty conservative state. And they were both public men. They both quietly supported civil rights and equal opportunities. And they really had kind of a meeting of the minds on many of these issues. And LBJ, of course, had been one of Neiman Marcus's best customers for years. And the two men were very close. Stanley Marcus was appointed to prominent positions in John Kennedy's administration. And, you know, and as Bill mentioned earlier, when Stanley Marcus tried to keep JFK from coming to Dallas, Lyndon Johnson is the person he talked to about that. And he's the one who reported that that's what LBJ had intended to say, kind of as a little joke, you know.
And Bill, there's a couple of other lines here which we should put on the record as well. JFK apparently saying to Jackie the night before the assassination, "Last night would have been a hell of a night to assassinate a president." And then the line you referenced earlier, JFK to his aide Kenny O'Donnell saying, "We're heading into nut country today," in reference to Dallas. But then he actually got there, the motorcade took off, and Dallas, a 250,000 people in the streets, unbelievably robust in their enthusiasm for it. What did they think when they saw that?
You know, it gives a lie to the objectification of Dallas, I suppose, even by extension, the way the city was demonized by historians as a city of hate. In Dallas, Steve and I have both very close ties there. We both lived there for a number of years and thought about this a lot and traveled a lot. To this day, people still associate, you know, that city with this act of violence. Sometimes just, you know, it's the first order of response. I remember traveling to Moscow a few years ago and just telling someone I happened to be from Dallas, and they raised their hand up like this and said, "Kennedy, Kennedy," and that was 30, you know, years afterwards. And I think all you need to do is look at the wonderful images from those visits that Kennedy made, even back in 1960. And then later on, people wanted to be near him, the charisma, the sense of optimism, hope, just to see him. And people flocked to the streets. Some of the largest crowds, in fact, the largest crowds up to that point in Dallas history were there to greet him. So again, it wasn't a city of hate. And what we maintain in our work, Dallas 1963, was that a handful of people had hijacked the microphone. They had stolen it, and they had used it to vilify a president, attacking him on different fronts. Again, almost a moral crusade, but then almost a military-style mission. And sadly, the rest of the city got kind of sucked into that sense, and surely everybody there must feel the same way. Unequivocally, there were many, many people there who were so glad to see him and truly loved him.
But Stephen, here's where the story gets incomprehensible. You take 300 pages to lay out the fact that, you know, every right-wing nut job seemed to be wanting to be in Dallas to protest President Kennedy's visit there, and yet it is not a right-wing nut job that ends up assassinating him at the end of the day. It's some insignificant, you know, would-be communist. How did you get your head around the irony of that?
Yeah, that's really, you know, a fascinating contradiction that people have been trying to wrap their heads around for years. And when you study Oswald, you can see that, you know, he was much more than just a communist. And in fact, he was a terrible failure as a communist. You know, he defected to the Soviet Union, and that didn't work out so well for him. He despised people in the working class. So clearly, you know, he self-identified as a communist, but in reality, he was a misfit. And when you look at, you know, people who are assassins throughout history, they don't act logically in the same ways that the rest of us might assume that they do. You know, the man who shot at Ronald Reagan, John Hinckley, before he shot at Reagan, he was stalking Jimmy Carter. You know, the man who shot at John Lennon, Mark David Chapman, and both of those guys are from Texas, I'm sorry to say. But Mark David Chapman, you know, he had his mind around the idea of shooting at Walter Cronkite. So, you know, these people aren't really guided by logic in the same way we are. And you certainly can't, definitively trace a line from Dallas's civic insanity to Lee Harvey Oswald pulling the trigger. But you can't say that when you have a guy who's prone to violence, he was beating his wife, and he had shot at General Walker earlier. He knew how to fire a gun. He was a marksman in the Marines. And you have somebody like that who's kind of unstable to begin with, and he's in an environment where people are shouting that the president should be killed, and you see all this really just massive hatred towards JFK coming out. It sure as hell didn't help the situation, did it?
Well, and it's also true, Bill, that Lee Harvey Oswald was in Dallas, but he wasn't from Dallas or of Dallas, and yet somehow Dallas has had to carry this can for 50 years now. Pretty unfair, I guess, eh?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. To echo a little bit of what my colleague Steve said, Oswald saw something in Dallas. He saw a handful of people who felt that they could make their stamp on history. They call themselves super patriots, and these are folks, again, on the right wing of things. And they were absolutists. They were, again, as self-described, super patriots. And there was a sense, again, above the cloud line among this handful of folks, that it was their right and really their mission to rewrite American history, because folks weren't doing it. They weren't protecting America in Washington and other cities, citadels of power. And so it's part of almost this thing that's in Texas, I think, this sense of us doing things apart from the government, a heavily deregulated state, and frankly a state that had once been its own nation. And so folks in Dallas, a handful, again, a small handful, felt that we almost needed to seize the reins. We're going to fight back and protect America in our way. And Oswald, in that environment, being very impressionable and also really wanting to leave his stamp on history, is somewhat a product of this environment, this overreaching in Dallas, and said, I too can rewrite history. And he attempted to do so.
Well, that's going to lead us in our last 2 minutes here. Let me give each of you a minute to ask that final question. I know your book is not about this. Your book is focused on Dallas of '63, but you presumably have come to some conclusions, each of you, as to whether or not you think Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. Stephen, how about it?
Yes, I think that as you mentioned, our book is so focused on these other people in Dallas, and we did all kinds of archival research. We have written documentation where these people are writing to friends and telling each other what they're up to, that you can say pretty conclusively what happened there. And with Oswald, we have very little of that kind of documentation, but what little there is seems to indicate that he was the lone shooter. And I tend to go along with what Oswald's own brother said. Robert Oswald understood Lee Harvey Oswald better than anybody, and he said, yes, my brother, I could see him doing that, and I believe he did do that.
Bill, how about you?
I feel the same way, and I think there's a cautionary parallel. As we've been traveling around talking about our book, I was in the state of Michigan talking to a retired auto worker who said, you fellas should change the title of your book to America 2013. And his point being that he believed that Oswald had acted alone, but that he had perhaps been influenced by this hothouse environment, the temperature again being turned up to the point where really awful, violent things occur, and I think that's the resonating thing that I dwell upon, even beyond whether Oswald was the lone gunman. But what can be the awful consequence when people don't have dialogue and shift over to hysteria and fanaticism?
Governor John Connolly's wife, Nellie, was in the motorcade, looked at John Kennedy and said, well, Mr. President, you can't say that Dallas doesn't love you. And a few seconds later, he was dead. Bill Minutaglio and Stephen L. Davis, it's awfully good of both of you to join us on the line from Austin, Texas, to remember this important moment in American history 50 years later. Thanks so much, gents.
Thanks, Steve.
It's been a pleasure.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.